First thing I want to do in this video is make a replacement for the 1-inch threaded rod. If you're having a problem finding one, this is a good solution for you. Also, if you're in a metric part of the world where even your blades are metric size, this will be a way to make a replacement for the threaded rod that will give you the correct spacing for a metric size blade. The first thing I did was I cut a piece of wood to 1 inch square and about 20 inches long. Actually need it longer than the jig for this to work properly. Hardwood is recommended. I'm using softwood here just as a demonstration, but you should use a dense hardwood, a closed grain, if possible, hardwood like maple. You want to avoid something like oak that has an open grain that might chip off easily. I got my table saw sled set up on my saw. I've also taken my framing square and I taped it down to the surface of the saw using the piece of wood that I cut as a guide. Tape just holds it in place so it can't move. Now I'm going to set the depth of cut on my saw to about 1/8 of an inch. I've got a thin curved blade in the saw. You really want to get a blade that you can find a regular washer, 3/16 inch washer, the same thickness as that, so that the washer will fit into this slot that you're cutting here without too much play. A little bit of play is okay, but not too much. The way this is going to work is I'm going to use my framing square, the marks that are on there, to guide this rod through for each cut. And what I'll do is I'll line up the end of it with the mark that's on the framing square. That way it'll be very accurate. All you need to do is eyeball the end of the rod with the mark, the center of the mark on the framing square, make your cut, move it over 1/4 inch, or whatever your spacing happens to be. If you're using it like a 2.5 inch millimeter saw blade, you'll want your spacing to be 5 millimeters exactly. So set up your ruler that has millimeters on it and make a cut every 5 millimeters. Okay, well, I got the whole thing cut. It took about, 5 minutes to cut them all. I know that they're very accurate because it was very easy to line up the rod with the marks on the square. So they can't be very far out, maybe 1/1000th of an inch, and that really isn't going to make much of a difference at all. No difference, actually. There are a couple of drawbacks with using this. The first is that you won't be able to cut the 1/16 inch box joints like you can with the other one, because the carriage can't move that 1/8 of an inch that you'll get with the 1-inch threaded rod. The other one is that you will be limited to a 1/4 inch travel per click on the advance lever, because that's the spacing I have here. You can't get the 3/8 like you'll be able to do with the 1-inch threaded rod. But otherwise, everything's exactly the same. You'll be able to cut every size box joint from 1/8 of an inch right on up, however big you want to cut them. Even with a single 1/8 inch blade, you'll still be able to make all of those joints. I've taken down my older advanced box joint jig, which is smaller. The plans are still available for this. It's an excellent jig for smaller projects. If you're only going to be doing smaller things, I would recommend making this one instead. And as you can see, the division plate in this is identical to this one. And you can use this method for cutting that one. It's really a whole lot easier. I got rid of the sled and I brought the jig back over to the table saw here to show what you would do next. You would cut it to length. It really, not really that important that it line up perfectly or anything. It should be the same length of the jig. You can let it stick out this end over here if you want. And what that'll do is it'll give you extra travel actually. So you get a little bit more capacity out of the jig. I think you'd be better off to cut it the same length though. Then you would slip it into the groove that the 1-inch threaded rod would normally go in. And I don't recommend gluing it in. What I recommend is driving small screws, maybe 2 or maybe 3, down through the top here. Drill pilot holes and drive the screws in. Maybe 3/4 inch number 6 screws. 3 of those would hold this in nicely. And that way, if it ever breaks or wears out, you can just undo the screws and pull it out and replace it. After you get it all fitted and ready to go in, I would take sandpaper, sand off the surface here to get rid of any of the woolies that happen when you cut it. Chamfer the edges a little bit with the sandpaper to get it cleaned up. Then I would take the same polyurethane, the water-based stuff, that you use to finish the jig and give it a good heavy coat. And what that'll do is it'll penetrate and sink into the wood and really toughen it up to make it so that it will not break or wear out as easily. The jig in this state will handle large pieces of wood really easily. You won't have to do anything else with it. Just clamp it in. You've got plenty of surface up here to clamp it onto. But if you want to cut smaller pieces, it's a good idea to make one of these. I just quickly made this up actually before I started doing any of this. It only took about 10 minutes. What it is a piece of 3/4 inch plywood that's cut to the same height as the jig here. It has a side fence, which is just a couple of pieces of solid wood glued on. I've got a clamping bar that works with carriage bolts that are countersunk into the back and adjusts with wing nuts. It's held in on the back with a couple of screws. These are just pieces of 3/8 inch plywood that I planed smooth actually, so they're about 5/16 of an inch. And to cut these on the jig without this accessory fence would be difficult, to say the least. It'd be very difficult to clamp them in. With it, you can just unscrew the nut, slip them in, put them up against the side fence, tighten the wing nuts so that they won't move. Check to make sure they slide back and forth like you normally would. Bring the thing back to the start position, and for this accessory fence, that'll be a little bit further over. You'll have to make another mark on the jig for that. In the setup video, I talked about doing this without offsetting, just putting them in straight like I did, and starting with stock that's wider. This is the way that I think is the best way to do it, because it avoids a lot of confusion with offsets and whatnot. It's always better, because I found that even if you do cut that offset, if you make that spacer and offset the pieces so that the joints line up, you still don't wind up with the joint that's exactly lined up. You have to do some adjustment afterwards. This way you can cut them like that, put them together where you want them to be, mark where they need to be cut, take them and rip them down to the final size that you need. Easy as that. Now, I just got them a little bit mixed up, but I think this is the way they go. And we'll stick them in and cut the other side. You can see these are very small parts. These are 2 inches wide and 3 inches long. Put them together like that. Now I can mark where the box joints end and begin so that I'll get nice even ones. I can even start on half of one if I want to, and then I'll cut them down to final size, the final width, and then glue the box together. You can always still use the spacer. It's just that I think that this way, first of all, winds up saving time in the end, because you can actually glue this together like it is right now without doing anything else with it. Then cut off all the sides on your table saw. And that's probably the best way. If you use a spacer, you'll often get confused. You'll often flip the work over to do the other side, offset the wrong ones, and wind up with unusable joints in material that might cost a lot of money. This is just plywood, but if you're using something like walnut or something like that, you really want to avoid problems like that. It's the next day. The last thing I did yesterday was glue up my little box here so that it's ready to work with today. I took it to the disc sander first and flushed up the sides, sanded the joints even. Now I have it at the table saw where I've set my fence to the width that I want, and I'm going to start cutting it down to size. So that's all there is to it. Like I say, for smaller boxes like this, way easier to glue it up first, then cut it off after. I started with stock that was 2 inches wide to begin with. I wound up with a box that's 1 3/4, which is what I wanted it to be. And I also have even box joints on the ends. I have one full one to start with and one full one to end with. I wanted to show one last thing before I go, and that's the scale that I drew on the top of the carriage here to show the relative position of it on the jig. And I added a little wooden pointer to the top of the locking bar that'll line up with the marks that are on the scale. At the start position is pointing to the 0 mark on the scale, and I have the jig set up right now for a 1/4 inch movement, so every click of the advance lever moves it a 1/4 inch, and you can see that easily on the scale. The scale, I just hand drew that right on top of the carriage. You can download and print off accurate tape measures that could be stuck on here with contact adhesive, but I find it easier and a little bit easier to see hand-drawn marks like this. If you would like to build this jig, there are plans available on my website. There's a link at the end of the video and in the description that'll take you right there where you can get them. Also, I made 2 other videos on my other channel, my main channel, and they cover putting the jig together and also setting it up and using it for the first time. If you've already built the jig or would like to build the jig and want some more information on this accessory fence right here, details for this and also the alternate threaded rod thing here will be on my website. There's also a link in the description to that. As usual, thanks for watching and see you next time.